I'm feeling like a little amoeba with some tentacles hanging out.
Most people look at me and they would never guess that I'm Jewish. If I'm talking about celebrating Hanukkah, they're like, for you though?
The image that you saw on the surface wasn't the actual image that you were supposed to be looking at.
My identity is like a coin. There are two sides. You know, when you throw up a coin, sometimes you don't know what you're gonna get, and that's sometimes how I feel. But at the end of the day, it is still one coin.
I immediately thought of two circles, like a smaller circle and a bigger circle. For me, being like mixed race or biracial or a halfie, subtle halfie transgender. A Venn diagram puts them so separately, but like two circles that really just make like a big circle and it just changes. Fluid identity, how about that? Nothing is really like...
Yeah, I'm feeling like a little, maybe like amoeba with some tentacles hanging out. Like definitely being one thing, like one of a whole is important to me when describing my identity. Like, you know, I've like gone back and forth thinking like, I'm half this or like blah, blah, blah. And like, I think now I've landed on that I want to just be a whole and not use half as much to describe. So it's something about one shape, but it can move throughout time.
So for me, I really wouldn't want to confine my identity to any one particular shape or symbol or pattern. I really appreciate the idea of universality and the Jewish idea of oneness. So for me, it's more about shape-shifting in a sense based on what sort of feels authentic to me with each moment and context. So I think I prefer to be a little bit more fluid and have that option.
Yeah, it's like very amorphous and gradient and the kind of thing that is probably going to be very difficult to draw, but just kind of gradients and flows moving, but no clear endpoint, you know?
A circle with squiggles around that kind of go in and out of the edge of the circle, because I think sometimes they really do intersect and they connect and it feels just right, and then sometimes I feel like they like just miss each other, or like I'm in conversations and people like can't make the connection, or they make like a general assumption about Jews or about Asians as if they're like separate. But then sometimes they cross and it feels like there's a connection.
I feel silly is my answer, but I think this goes with my Asian American and my Jewish identity, and also my identity as a non-binary person is a havdalah candle. The fact that they, you know, have to be combined together and to make the one wick, even though, you know, they're talking about separation, but they are literally like two into one.
So there was this symbol that I always used to draw, and it really took on increased importance for me as I got older, representing the interfaith background that I have. So the symbol is a crescent moon, representing the Muslim faith.
The moon with the star in the center.
And then instead of the normal star that sits inside of that crescent,
I would always draw a Jewish star in the middle, drawing the similarities between the two cultures, two religions.
As this thing that is not as polarized and separate as a lot of people like to think that it is.
And another symbol that I think of is the khamsa, because that's translated between cultures. I think it's so beautiful because it like protects you from the evil eye and all of these symbols that it has in both cultures and gives you luck.
I drew a painting of a dragon in a khamsa, and I think that perfectly matches like the Jewish Asian of me.
A lot of the things I'm drawn to are like being able to be a little bit of a chameleon, and if I'm in a Muslim setting, then people are gonna see if I'm wearing like a khamsa or something, they'll think, oh, that's like from our culture, we know what that is. And if I'm at synagogue, people are gonna be like, oh, that's a khamsa, like I know that's something I really value, is not having to explain myself all the time.
I thought of a tree, like there's a trunk in a tree and there's a strong foundation and a base, but also the leaves always fall away every now and again during the fall season. Because sometimes I feel like my identity falters. There are jagged journeys that I encounter just because it's so confusing sometimes. But I always find myself grounding myself and thinking about how much my identities mean to me and how much they have formed, and I go back to that base.
I would be a tree in the winter. On really young trees, around the winter time, you chop off pretty much 3/4 of the tree because it allows the root system to get more established. And with everything that's going on in our world right now, it's impermanent, but we are growing through it. I've been like Marie Kondoing my apartment. I like purged half of my belongings and feel liberated. So I'd say I'm a tree in the winter, turning inwards so that whatever comes next, we will show up fully in the next season.
I would say a tree in autumn, because all the leaves are different colors, kind of like all the different parts of my background, and it's all connected to that one trunk that goes into all those roots that reaches back to history. That's kind of my biggest part, especially as a mixed person. I've always really wanted to have a connection to my history, but because both sides of my family have experienced pretty rough lives, there's parts of my family that I just don't know about. I feel like you should be able to create your identity outside of your family, but I also feel like this is a big part of both Jewish and Asian culture, that family is really connected to who you are, and I just want to know more.
That's such a beautiful answer. Also, I was gonna say tree, and you took it! Damn. But I don't know if you guys remember those Magic Eye books that were very trendy when we were growing up. When you first open it, it's just a cacophony of colors and patterns. You're kind of like, what is it that I'm supposed to be looking at? The things don't necessarily fit together, and then someone says, well, wait, take your time and focus on it. Try to like actually see what it is, and then from that an image comes forth. I've never been able to successfully do one. I was always fascinated with them for the very specific reason that the image that you saw on the surface wasn't the actual image that you were supposed to be looking at. And I think that sums up pretty well how I felt if I had a conversation with a stranger. The first question I'll get is like, what are you? You know, or like, let me guess what I think you are, right? And so this idea of like, well, hold on whatever you think your assumption is of me, and like actually take the time to understand who I am, and then the truer picture of my identity can come forth from that.
I think if I'm imagining my identity, unfortunately it's more like just a Venn diagram, overlap. I grew up mostly with my mother, and I would see my father for summers. I would fly to South Africa, but I would spend 10 months of my life in Queens, New York with my mother and my grandmother. And so I've kind of like explored both avenues of my identity, but there's never really been any overlap, which honestly doesn't sound amazing, but I'm okay with it. I've given like room for each to grow, and coming to college, I've like invested more time in growing each. I've joined like this Jewish Life Federation of sorts, where like we speak about what it means to be like a modern Jew, while simultaneously joining the South Asian Student Association, where I can come more into contact with other South Asians. So it's been very like pursuing the two avenues, but separate, which is all right.
My Jewish identity, I guess I can see it as a triangle. I was raised super Jewish, conservative Jew, like went all the way up. That's all I kind of knew. And then because I became so resentful that I didn't have room to identify any other way, I then had feelings of like really downward. And then now that I've had the space to kind of figure that out for myself, it's plateaued. So it's like up, down, there. So it's like a triangle. And then with my Japanese identity, I guess it's like a pulse, like the hospital one. It's plateaued, then it goes up, then it goes down, then it kind of goes straight. My Jewish side dominated so much that I didn't get a chance to explore that side, because most of the time it was just the way I looked, and a lot of that was because of the industry. People love to ask like, what are you, or what do you look like, and just kind of put you in a box. I've had mixed feelings about both, but they've all had their different paths.
For me, I was raised by my mom and grandma, who are Ashkenazi Jews, and I had very little contact with my dad growing up. He's second generation Japanese American, and my mom is second generation Jewish American, so I'm third generation on both sides. And I was not influenced by my Japanese side at all until I would say in my 20s, when my dad started coming back in my life. And even then, he wasn't raised with Japanese culture really, especially because his family was interned. And especially since my dad passed away earlier this year, I've been really pondering the question of how do I still stay connected to my Asian side now that he's not there, and I don't really have a relationship with my cousins or with my grandmother on that side. And because I'm so heavily influenced by my Jewishness, I think that I'm kind of like a spiral. Not necessarily like spiraling out of control, but just constantly looking and constantly trying to find new ways to connect, new ways to merge my identities together. And I would say that's me.
I went with a symbol because I'm half Chinese and we use symbols in our language, and so this one was quite easy for me. My Chinese name, which was given to me by my mom and my Chinese grandfather. So it's Dai Li, and it means the jasmine, which are usually white flowers, but it's the black jasmine. And so I think that kind of represents me, because I was always the token in anywhere I was. So if it was a Hebrew school, I was the only Asian girl there. When I was living in China, I was the only Jewish girl in my whole school. And so my name has kind of stuck with me as a symbol that represents me. Sometimes I wish it was my actual name.
California to me really describes what my identity is, because my parents are from California. My mom grew up in Van Nuys, which is the biggest Jewish place in like the 70s and 80s. She was like, yes, all of my friends were Jewish. The entire city Pinhasi was a very huge Jewish center. And then I was adopted from China and I lived in California for my whole life. I did read a study a while ago how people who are mixed race or have more than one identity tend to form stronger bonds towards the area that they were raised in as a kind of a piece of identity. So I always think of it as that way. It's like California is where everyone kind of mixed together. There's Chinatown here and there's like great Jewish delis here, you know? It's the best of both worlds.
My identity shape is that fortune teller from elementary school, where you write colors on the outside, BLUE, and then you open it up and then you choose a number and you keep going. So much of how I move about the world is based on what people see on that outside, what the colors are on the outside. People see me, they assume, right, that I'm a woman, that I'm a brown woman of color, that I'm short and a little chubby, right? There's all of these assumptions. Most people look at me and they would never guess that I'm Jewish, even when it's glaringly in the face. If I'm talking about celebrating Hanukkah, right? They're like, for you though? Or was it your friend? It must have been your friend. So there's like these layers and you open it up and there's deeper stuff, right? Like the values and the stories and the fears that I grew up with, or the things that really matter to me, which are the foundational pieces that everything else is built upon. So it's a matter of like, how much have we developed this relationship that I can show you all of the answers on the inside of the fortune teller.
I feel like the thing that describes how my identities connect and don't connect the most is one of those old style family quilts. Like one of those like really ugly ones that was like made in the early 20th century, but your grandma keeps on passing down and everyone keeps on adding on to it. I'm just like now starting to really conceive my identities as like one growing and evolving and intrinsic whole. But as growing up, you know, I kind of separated my identities into disparate experiences, which now I think is counterproductive, because while they are like, you know, independent, they're not mutually exclusive. I feel like they all come together to create a bigger whole. And I feel like all these different experiences in our communities and identities create who we are. And I feel like it's unique for all of us, given our unique backgrounds. But overall, I think it's a very comfy and beautiful thing at the end of the day.